And so that is the lived reality of the U.S. hands behind the back model of free trade, and it's the one that the U.S. is not going to tolerate anymore.
And you would put, obviously there's no particular moment, but you would put China joining the World Trade Organization as the sort of moment where the scales became very unbalanced against America. We're back at ARC for day 2 of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship here at the thrilling Excel Centre in East London. And I'm delighted to be joined by the great Oren Cass, who had, I'm calling you great. Yeah.
And good.
And good. Great and good. Oren Cass, who is the founder of American Compass and chief economist at the American Compass. And you wrote a very interesting piece for The Spectator last week on tariffs. And of course, tariffs are back in the news. They're going to be in the news for a while. What do you think about the idea of a reciprocal tariff? Because in your piece, you talked about how Trump is using tariffs as a negotiating tariff. They are negotiating tariffs. What are reciprocal tariffs?
Well, reciprocal tariffs are sort of an interesting hybrid in a sense. I mean, the criticism of a reciprocal tariff typically is that you're essentially handing control over your tariff policy over to the other side. You're saying, well, we'll just do what you do. But there's also a compelling logic to that. I think there's both a coherence. I think speaking to a domestic audience, it's very helpful to say, well, the reality is we're not starting the trade war. We're not ruining free trade. We're just doing what everybody else already is doing. And to the extent that what you actually aspire to is to have freer trade, especially among Western democracies, then the incentives of a reciprocal tariff can make a lot of sense. You're essentially communicating to the world, we would prefer freer trade, but we are no longer going to accept this situation where America just turns the other cheek. And so this is our now very decipherable, predictable policy, and essentially now it's your move.
Yes. So it's almost incumbent on the opposite party to say, well, actually, we can lose our tariff. If you won't do it to us, we can lose ours.
Yes, that's right. And in a sense, I think it also calls the bluff, particularly of the Europeans who, enjoy showing up at all of these conferences and, looking down their noses at Donald Trump, who's breaking the wonderful liberal world order. Say, well, actually, there is no wonderful liberal world order. You guys have been free riding on the sort of benevolent hegemony of the U.S. for decades. And that is over, and you can either get your act together or not, but that's sort of your problem, not ours.
Yes, I mean, I take your point about America's benevolent hegemony, but I think sometimes it's a little overstated, because I mean, in return for America's hegemony, economic hegemony, in terms for the sort of ripping off on tariffs which you do face in the world. And you pay for, security in many ways. You do get to be the economic superpower.
What does that mean? What do you get to be?
Well, you get the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which of course could change. You get to dominate in Britain. You get to dominate our markets very much. I mean, it's good for us in some ways, but American companies dominate the city. American companies dominate most of our retail sector. If you go to a supermarket, you buy products, there's a high likelihood they come from America. I mean, just in terms of Britain, I mean, it's not entirely that America has been sort of, slaving away for our welfare. It's not, I mean, there's a trade-off in everything, is there not?
Well, there is. I think, the dollar is a particularly important point because it is one, this is the key point a lot of folks will emphasize, that the reserve currency has been called the sort of exorbitant privilege. And it is in the sense that it lets the U.S. borrow a lot and run up a lot of debt. I'm not sure that's a privilege, right? The exorbitant privilege of being mailed lots of credit card offers isn't really an exorbitant privilege at all. And in fact, what I think most folks would acknowledge is that being the reserve currency, and there are a number, even what it means to be the reserve currency means a number of things, but it is very good for being a financial center. It's very good for running up debt. It is not good for workers. It is not good for a manufacturing sector. It's not good for the sort of discipline, frankly, I think a democratic political system needs. And so I don't think that the U.S. has actually been benefiting from it significantly at all. If you were to make a case of the benefit, I think it typically would be much more in the foreign policy sense, that it essentially gives you leverage to impose sanctions and so forth. But I think the Russia situation over the past few years has fairly comprehensively refuted that. People thought the U.S. was building up this powerful weapon, and then it finally tried to fire it. And it was, sort of like the cartoon gun where like the little flag comes out the end and says pop, and it in fact had no actual hard power effect at all. And so I certainly take your point that is a consequence of the U.S. hegemony has been the reserve currency. I don't think the typical American has benefited from that necessarily.
Negotiating tariffs, as you describe them in this piece, serve a not entirely dissimilar function to sanctions in a way, don't they? They are a way of saying, unless you change your behavior, you're going to have to face this economic consequence.
Yes, that's a great point. They are a tool of economic statecraft. And part of the liberal world order view that the U.S. has promoted is, generally speaking, that economic power shall not be used as a tool of statecraft, that markets will be markets, everyone should be leaving them alone to generate prosperity, and we will have an exception where we use sanctions in truly extraordinary situations, in the middle of a hot war, addressing terrorism and so forth. And again, it's a very sort of strange, anachronistic point of view. Economic power has always been a tool of statecraft. And even in recent decades, other countries, certainly China has recognized its importance, and the U.S. has, as a result, sort of just been tying its hands behind its back. Now, again, if you say, but the benefit that it gets from that is in promoting this global economic system from which it benefits, that would be very nice. The reality of recent decades has been that the benefit side of that cost benefit has not been there.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
And it seems as though people within the Trump administration believe that tariffs aren't just negotiating tools. They can have some reciprocity, but also they can help build up American manufacturing. How quick will that process be? I mean, will there be a lot of disruption, pain while it goes on? I mean, you can't just sort of build up an industrial base. America has an industrial base to a large extent, but other European countries are now talking about this. Don't really have, Britain doesn't have an industrial base anymore. You can't just sort of flip a switch and have an industrial base. It's going to be a painful process, is it not?
It's certainly going to be a process. I think to what extent it is a painful one depends on a couple of things. One is how sort of quickly you do it, because the flip side is you don't have to flip the switch on the tariff side of things. I think the best way that you would want to approach it is to essentially establish a predictable phase-in. And it's important to notice that contrasts exactly with the negotiating tariff framework, right? If you're using a tariff as leverage, it would make very little sense to say, we want you to do X, and if you don't, then gradually over the next 5 years, we will begin to phase this thing in. You're trying to, in a sense, maximize pain for the other side, even if there's the potential for pain on your side as well. When you're talking about economic tariffs, an actual kind of new steady state for rebalancing the global economy and for promoting reindustrialization in the U.S., then the predictable phase-in is actually ideal, because the heart of what you're actually trying to do is change investment behavior. You want more capital investment in the U.S. in domestic production, and that requires predictability. That does take time. But I think the flip side is it doesn't actually take that much time. We are talking about a sort of 3 to 5 year period, not a 30-year period. And the two ways you can see that, the sort of proof of this is, first of all, if you look at how quickly the deindustrialization happened after China was welcomed to the WTO, you go back and look at that U.S. manufacturing employment chart. It falls off a cliff. That only could happen because someone was scaling something else up just as quickly. And the other example that I think is a really useful one to understand is looking at what Ronald Reagan did in the 1980s with the auto industry. Somehow we've come to think of Reagan as a free trader. He wasn't. He liked the idea of free trade and wanted to promote it, but he was also a realist. And in fact, when he left office, the Cato Institute, which is the very libertarian think tank in the U.S., he called Reagan the worst protectionist since Herbert Hoover, because vis-a-vis Japan, which was the sort of abuser of the global trading system at the time, he took very harsh protectionist action. And the biggest one was in the early 1980s when Japanese vehicles were flooding the U.S. market. The U.S. and Japan just negotiated an absolute quota, not even a tariff, more extreme than that. Just the number of vehicles coming into the U.S. shall not grow any longer. Now, was there a price effect initially? Yes. The best estimates are that a cost of a Japanese vehicle went up 5 to 10% in the U.S. Initially. But what also happened is that every Japanese automaker opened up assembly plants in the U.S. South. And within a few years, all of that extra production was occurring domestically. What then followed was the entire supply chains behind that. Eventually, the Toyota Camry actually became the most American car on the road. There was more U.S. content in a Camry than in any other vehicle, including not foreign vehicle, more than in a Ford, more than in a Chevy. And within a few years, you didn't even need the quota anymore. Once the Japanese automakers had actually committed to the investments in the U.S., it turned out the U.S. was a perfectly viable place to make cars. And I think that is the sort of bigger picture point that people, there's a classic example, someone was saying, oh, well, if we put a tariff on Chinese toasters, how much would it cost to make a toaster in America? It's like $300. It's like, well, that's ridiculous. Like, well, yes, if you spend 30 years not making toasters in America and then turn around and say, okay, make one tomorrow, you're obviously not going to be able to do it. How much would it cost to actually make a toaster in the U.S. with modern technology after you had invested in doing it here? There isn't really any reason to believe it is significantly more expensive to be producing things in the U.S. if you actually have a policy structure that makes that something that we actually care about.
Libertarians do seem to be obsessed with toasters. It's an ongoing theme in libertarian rhetoric. But it's interesting you mentioned cars, because Donald Trump seems to be very preoccupied with cars, and a lot of his sort of political consciousness or economic political consciousness is about the cars that he saw in the 80s and 90s in New York, and he thought, why don't BMW get to be here and we don't get to be there? That's very much seems to be driving his sense of unfairness, and it has done for several decades.
Well, the two things to say about the auto sector, one is, people say, oh, that's a political thing, like people feel like cars are important. The automotive sector is the core of the industrial sector, certainly in the U.S., in probably just about any developed economy. It is such a substantial segment of manufacturing, of consumption at the end of the day.
And jobs.
And jobs as a result. But my point being, not because there's some sort of nostalgic attachment to them, but because making cars for people is in fact one of the most important and productive economic activities in a developed society. And so I think there's sort of a rightful focus with that, coupled with, partly as a result, it is the place where maybe the most trade-related chicanery has been going on forever, and it has been extremely obvious to analysts in the United States that the way that the global market has evolved makes no sense under kind of typical economic theories, right? Why is it the case that all of these vehicles from everywhere else now are imported into the U.S., but nothing is exported from the U.S. to anywhere else. And why is it the case that there's a 10% tariff on U.S. vehicles coming into Europe and only a 2.5% tariff on European vehicles coming? It's actually a little bit strange. And then, of course, China shows up and is, again, as everywhere else, the worst offender, has 25% tariffs. And you see the consequences of that. The most obvious one was that Tesla, in order to start selling in the Chinese market, had to go open a manufacturing plant in Shanghai. And this is the quintessential example where, okay, if free trade were working, right, the cutting edge, leading edge technology in electric vehicles developed in the United States with both public subsidies and U.S. capital investment, innovation, and now we have the best product, we could sell that to China. That would be fantastic. Imagine all jobs. Nope. No, you can't. You have to go set up the factory in China. What happens once you do that? Well, two things. First of all, the Chinese government pays you to do it, makes it the best place to build your cars. Pretty soon it's Tesla's biggest manufacturing facility. By some estimates, the majority of all Teslas worldwide. And then all of the Chinese engineers who you train in your Tesla factory leave to build up Chinese EV manufacturers who then eat Tesla's lunch in China. And so within about 5 years, you then have Elon Musk saying, actually, we can't even compete with these Chinese EV companies, and they're going to sort of eat everybody's lunch, and now the U.S. market is going to need protection. And so that is the lived reality of the U.S. hands behind the back model of free trade, and it's the one that the U.S. is not going to tolerate anymore.
And you would put, obviously there's no particular moment, but you would put China joining the World Trade Organization as the sort of moment where the scales became very unbalanced against America.
I think that's right. I mean, it's important to...
Was it 93, 94?
So China, WTO was 2000. And so you really had this decade when the Cold War ended. You had NAFTA, you had WTO, and you had then welcoming China into the WTO.
Right. So Clinton is the villain.
In a sense, although it's important to keep in mind that obviously Republicans were fully supportive of and egging him on. I mean, you go back to the 2000 election, Bush v. Gore, sort of a contest to see who was most excited about promoting free trade and embracing China the fastest. This was an entirely bipartisan project, and I think that speaks to what was this very peculiar era after the Cold War in the United States, where we did just sort of, some people call it kind of the end of history, or I think more appropriately, the holiday from history. It was, to some sense, give them credit for their optimism and what was a coherent theory of what they wanted to accomplish. It's just important to recognize that it failed, and that, with China as an example, the main case for welcoming China to WTO was that as a result of doing that, they would liberalize, they would democratize, they would embrace free markets. If you had known what you know now, that it was going to be the opposite, if you could go back to 2000 and tell somebody what the China of 2025 looks like, it's extremely hard to imagine someone saying, well, let's go for it. This is a good idea, this is what we should do. And so the question is now, how do we correct course? And you have a lot of people who have committed their careers to promoting this at this point. You certainly have a lot of businesses that have committed their business model and their profits to promoting it. So there's plenty of resistance to correcting course. But as an intellectual matter, it's just, we have to grapple with the fact that the case for what we are doing no longer exists. Based on the experience we've actually had.
You mentioned the engineers there in China. I'd like to ask you a little bit about how, as we moved into this new technological age with AI, probably low-skilled jobs being deleted on a large scale, the argument for China as the world's factory was always masses of labour, masses of human capital. But China also is capable of producing very high-level human capital at a very large scale, probably not something America's able to match. So if America's going to reindustrialize on a big scale. There's going to be this big debate about visas that we've already seen a little bit of. Is that going to be, in the way you'd like the world to go, is that going to be one of the great tension points? Is where does America get where does it get its engineers from? I mean, if your education system is not able to produce enough engineers, you need presumably better education, but that's going to take time too.
Well, I think part of what the sort of visa debate or the immigration debate has conflated is two very different types of human capital or meanings of engineer, in a sense. I think there's still very high levels of widespread support across the political system, with Americans generally, for wanting to still be a place that attracts the best and the brightest. That, genuinely the top folks who are, advancing breakthroughs, building companies and so forth, bring an enormous amount of value to the United States. The problem is that our immigration system, including our visa system, does not focus on that. The typical, quote, high-skilled visa for a, quote, engineer goes to a sort of entry-level worker paid below the median wage for somebody in one of the tech sectors, and is mainly a tool used either to hold down wages or to facilitate outsourcing to other countries. And so this was the funny thing when this debate blew up in the US, it almost instantly resolved itself in technical terms. There was nobody really willing to defend the system as it works today, but besides the tech companies, I suppose. And conversely, there was almost nobody who was saying, we don't want top AI talent or anything like that. So I don't think that's actually the sort of obstacle or the tension. I think, to your point, there's a very interesting question. Okay, if regardless of what levels of free trade we do or don't have, what does it look like for the U.S. in particular and the Western world more broadly to be in an economic competition with a China-centered bloc, or however you want to think about its sphere of influence, that is sort of a peer. Even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had its sources of strength, but as an actual kind of economic force or source of technological innovation, it was understood how far behind it was. We don't really have in our memory a world where, wow, there's that other competitor, people call it sort of the Sputnik moment, maybe was the last time, hey, there's this competitor over there that is not our friend, is not on our team, and like they're doing some stuff that we can't do. Like that will be a different feeling, to be sure. But I think that there are two things to be said about it. One is it's inevitable. It's not something that we have any control over. And I think J.D. Vance has given some important speeches recently, particularly at the Munich Security Conference. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also been delivering some very important comments along these lines, focusing just particularly on the fact that the kind of liberal mindset of let's wish cast the world we would like to have is just a very bad way of doing foreign policy. The important point is to start from the world that we do have and accept what we actually do and do not have the power to influence or shape. Short of the kinds of measures that we should not take and probably would not work anyway, we can't prevent China from developing, growing, achieving its own technological expertise. We can certainly stop helping it along. That would be a good place to start. But China is going to be a superpower and technological force in its own right. And we need a foreign policy and an economic model and a security posture that accepts and responds to not that just remains in denial that it is going to be something that happens.
I suppose the Clinton era hope with China was that it would liberalize and it would become a more fair partner in trade over time. That doesn't seem to have happened. But what you're talking about, if we're going to not indulge in wishful thinking, what we're looking at is a Cold War that is going to become less cold as these two blocs struggle for world domination.
Well, I don't know that it will become less cold, and I also don't know that they necessarily have to struggle for world domination, right? One driving factor in the first Cold War was that the sort of Leninist, Stalinist communism of the Soviet Union was explicitly striving for world domination. And you can find facets of that thinking in in Mao, in Xi's comments about China. But I think there's also a world we could envision moving toward where you do have different powerful nations that respect each other's spheres of influence to some extent. I think that the U.S. obviously has significant interests in Asia. It has allies like Japan and India that will ensure that it plays a role there, and that ideally China doesn't kind of assert hegemony there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a China that sees it as in its interest, or pursues the interest of sort of trying to pick some global fight on an expansionist model, particularly if the U.S. signals that it's not going to prevent China from asserting its legitimate prerogatives. So, we always struggle, I think, to envision models of global relations beyond like the current one or maybe the one right before it. But in world history more broadly, and looking forward to a very different, globalized world where everyone is in contact with each other, I think we need statesmen who are going to figure out what a plausible, sustainable model is and build toward it, not either try to return to some specific past one or cling to the current failed one.
Oren Cass, it's always fascinating to hear your point of view. Thank you very much for coming on to the Americano Show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.